concepts and mathematical formulas, also technical apparatuses and experiments. Physics, as a thinking, does not separate. The two concepts circulate between these things, so between language and apparatuses and experiments. And this circulation in the movement of a unique thinking, there's something very suggestive there for our future. So in other words, not separating, there's something going on here between the circulation, which is what we want to try to get at here. So the artificial is demonstrative within a discourse, and in relation to that discourse, it works upon it. All those examples from the MA, from the Royal College of Art MA in Design Interaction are actually there, working on discourses, the kind of stuff that Tony Dunn's program works on. There ought to be a slide illustration. But what we're actually also here is that we can actually think about the concept of apparatus too, which was, again, introduced to us by Ed, and in some ways also developed here by Ted. The way that we think of objects not just as tools, but actually ways of comprehending the world, understanding, perceiving, understanding, making sense of the world, communicating or being communicated to and distributed to, hence the popularity of the iPhone. And we can think of apparatus, though, in another sense, where Foucault introduces it. Whereas he calls apparatus the whole kind of set of things here. Discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philosophical propositions, he's talking about 18th century, are kind of the elements of a governing apparatus, the network that can be established between these elements. And what's interesting here is that in an epoch of high artifice, the technological and the artificial would have to figure much, much more in that heterogeneous set. But what's important here is that we start thinking of not individual networks, but of networks of combining different forms of networks that combine different forms of networks and systems, and which are also tied in to institutions, discourses, and that these make, in a sense, government, inverted commas. They make power, they make politics. And this is not far off from Bourdieu again, and given a more anthropological notion in Bourdieu's delightful concept of the habitus, which is really a lovely kind of sentence here. The habitus is those set of practices, systems, durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. He's talking about the way in any traditional society forms reinforce that culture, a pattern of that culture. It can be through dress, it can be through body, it can be through language, it can be what we call culture, it can be through how our village is organized, it can be through building, and of course all of this can apply to what we are talking about. But this notion of structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures, it's exactly what an iPhone is. It's a structuring structure, which also structures practices, structures expectations. And does so, as Lanier pointed out, so much technology does, almost below consciousness, just in the way that in the kind of society studied by anthropologists, they tend to think of these things not done through conscious law, but actually happening by kind of habit, inverted commas, habit, expectation. Regulated without being the product of the obedience to rules, collectively orchestrated without being the product of a single conductor. This notion, which is obviously operative in our society. We finally might add here, practices is in another related and slightly different sense when we talk of the forms in which social needs are met. This quotation comes from the UK in the 1960s and almost needs to be translated, but I think you'll get the theme. It's a very long quote, and I'm going to read it to you because I like the rhythm of it. What it is, it's a social historian, Stephen Yeo, and he's talking about the relationship of material human needs and forms and the politics of them. Producing, distributing and using basic goods, such as food, soap or clothes. Learning in general about the universe as well as particular. Entertaining and being entertained, getting and embellishing shelter, finding ways of dealing with old age, infancy, sickness, periods of less or no productive work. All of these, he says, are material human needs. As soon as a brief list is made, workshops, factories, farms, allotments, schools, families, chain stores, co-ops, corner shops, the varieties of product and social relations involved in meeting or exploiting such needs cry out, so that we have material human needs. We have an extraordinary variety of the possible ways in which these can be designed. For example, mutual assurance for fraternity through friendly societies, private insurance for profit through companies, or national insurance for social security through the state. Are each of them ways of dealing with old age, infancy, sickness and other contingencies. However, they're not the same, he says. Here's where the politics comes in. This is exactly Obama and versus Romney. The various methods have not remained static throughout their history, nor has the relative presence of any or either of them been constant. This is important. A society in which one form is dominant and the other recessive would not be the same as one in which the roles were reversed. Again, a kind of obvious point, but I want us to get at that point. So the forms of things here, we're talking about social forms, but these forms are not simple. And then he says, look at this. From a conservative point of view, attempts are always being made to collapse ways of life into a single society or system. To say that if you're going to have basic goods X, Y, or Z, say cheap soap or mass insurance, you must have form A, B, or C. Say Unilever or the Prudential, these are large English companies. So there's always a way in which collapsing alternatives. The way is then open to say that the ways we meet, define, multiply or divide needs constitute a single culture. The function of so doing is to remove from view ownership, power, struggle and interest. It is to conceal alternative, latent potentials and achievements in the interests of what is existing. In this way, he says, at the end, a terrifying closure between possibility and what is would have been effective. By contrast, to change social and material relations requires a somewhat finer perspective. To change social relations means to realize them in one of the other forms they make materially possible at any one time, as opposed to understanding them or explaining them from the point of view of what they predominantly are. So again, Yeo is a kind of quite interesting sort of social historian, but comes out in the end with a kind of manifesto for change. So Yeo is, I think, really, in effect, extending Simon's extension of design into professional practices to include all the ways that we link human needs with varieties of products and relations, and give these linkages precise forms and identities. Give them, in a word, a configuration. In my scribbled diagram, we begin to negotiate this relationship here. Thus, Yeo links us to politics and economics, and that's important. Takes us right into social form and politics. But the real point is, in a certain way, Yeo's use of social forms is not terribly far away from the traditional use of form in design. Forms are always shapes of inventive and creative negotiation between human needs, products, and relations. This is as true of the Constitution as it is of the Oxopila, and it's no less true for apps on the iPhone. So this is the point here. There is a relationship, a flow between these things. What this also teaches, this comes out of the last couple of lectures, the effective truth of Larry Keeley's great throwaway observations about features and capabilities, how on the resonance of a product by having the features and capabilities of persons, features and capabilities of things intermeshing. If social forms like products are the result of a three-way negotiation between needs, products and relations, all taking place in a determinable but never entirely fixed set of circumstances, then the end product, whatever it is, whatever form it takes, will encapsulate in itself those needs, relations, and circumstances. This begins to show you how complex a design form is. In other words, the design form, the product, only works once the needs, relations, and circumstances are somehow encapsulated in it. So we've actually extended Keely's notions of features and capabilities now to actually give it a kind of social dimension. And we can kind of define it in terms of this: designing, the inventive and creative act of negotiating, the encapsulating into the configuration of a product or a situation, needs, relations, and circumstances. Context. So what I'm doing here is linking this back to the older notion we looked at last week about features and capabilities. So now we're getting a much more extended view, model of designing. Now all of this links, this happens in contexts where complex negotiation is required because the situation is extraordinarily complex. Wicked, in Rittle's famous term. Rittle was a planner from the 1950s, and he used this term, wicked problem, to describe a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are very often even difficult to recognize. That's the important bit about this. The term wicked issue is not a sense of evil, but resistance to resolution. In other words, the problem can never be solved optimally. It can only be solved partially. Satisficing is the term that Herbert Simon uses a lot for exactly this reason. And those of you who want to pursue that, that's why I gave you the Dick Buchanan piece. It is rather an interesting thing to consider. Rittle, in 1973, formulated it under a set of actually 10 characteristics, including things like, I won't go into them now, but no definitive formulation of a problem can be made. There's no stopping rule. There's no true or false. There's no immediate or ultimate test. Every solution has to be a one-shot operation. I mean, it's not quite true to say there's no opportunity to learn by trial and error. I think iteration is that. Wicked problems do not have an innumerable or exhaustively describable set of potential solutions. They're to some extent unique. They can be often considered, this was James' point, symptom of another problem down at 8 there. Existence of a discrepancy representing a wicked problem can be explained in numerous ways. So the discrepancies that give rise to it could be explained in different ways. Therefore, you could look at the same problem, see the explanation for the discrepancy of the problem in genuinely other ways. There isn't just even one way of looking at the problem. The planner has to ultimately ignore the last one, but the 9 ones there. That's quite important, I think. Now, when we say negotiations here, I'm referring both to negotiations, we understand the term, conversation with stakeholders, as the nasty UK term having, conversing with the site, as Donald Sean more romantically has it, but also the wider negotiation of the process itself, all that I try to capture in my notion of the capabilities of the design. Because what I was implicitly doing here, in beginning to formulate this notion of capacities or capabilities of design, is to try to say, if there are wicked problems, then there must be wicked capabilities in order to deal with wicked problems. And that designing is complicated because it deals not with one set of capacities or capabilities, but a whole mass of capabilities and capacities. Those, and I just listed them here. I won't give you the whole 50. This is, if you looked at my text, and this is taken from straight from that. And I actually now prefer the version in the sentences. They explain more, but even as evocative terms. But just to go through, capacities for critical apprehension of a situation, critical capacities to be able to actually look at things critically, to see what is missing, to pose a question, to ask about categories. Capacities that have to do with the capability of moving from existing to preferred situations, things like speculation, invention, intervention, those kind of capacities. Capacities that have to do with organizing, planning, strategizing, everything from scenarios, articulating, schematics, programming. Capacities involved in conceiving and bringing something new into the world, what I want to call natalic capacities, but I don't think that word actually exists. I invented it. Propositional, anticipative, prefigurative capacities. Capacities in how we configure and reconfigure things, formative, configurative disposition. Capacities for mediating and attuning. Capacities for resonance, reciprocity, synthesis. Processual capacities, how you translate a concept into realization. This is almost what we might call art school capacities. Notice that's the only one that really does art school capacities. Poetic and transfigurative capacities, revelation, embellishment, emblematization, refinement, transfiguration, and capacities for evaluation. It's not a finished list, it's complete. It could be added to what you want, but you begin to see what we're talking about. The capacities of design are complicated because the processes of negotiating, encapsulating into the configuration of a product or situation, needs, relations, and circumstances is extremely complex. The folding together of these things is by definition a complex activity. It gets more complex as things get more complex. This great slide that comes from Latour's essay on systems that you'll get next week puts out the bits of the Challenger spaceship after it had blown up on its launch pad in Florida. And they're laid out according to the Challenger, but also according to the parts of NASA, which was organizationally responsible for those things. You see this vast hangar. It's a colossal scale that you can just about tell by the figures in the background. It's kind of some notion of the organizational complexity that actually goes into a product. Given this complexity, it's natural that the capabilities of design must be of a scale or measure to be able to range across the complexity demanded. This is a long way indeed from simply design by drawing. Yet of course the tacit complexity of the latter and the tacit complexity of design by making is enormous. Has anybody actually grasped the true complexity of configuring, that means designing, making and enacting the great Gothic cathedrals? If you want terrifying complexity, there it is. Terrifying. The extraordinary range. Now, let me turn now to my case study. Which I'm insisting is a 21st century object, and I'll explain to you why. Even though it's all but 80 years old, but that's partly why it's a 21st century object. It's because it is one of the great successful design case studies of design-led innovation in the 20th century. It's still going on into the 21st century. So we're going to look at this now, and I'm going to use this as a kind of, use the rest of the talk that I can persuade you to sit here on to try and do this. I'll probably spend the other hour doing this, but I'll try to go through this. This is almost entirely visual, just purely slides. The LUD is exemplary on several grounds. The first I'm already suggesting to you that it's managed to last. Here's one of the first poster versions from 1934. Here's 1964. Here's 2011. So you can see that basically, especially since 1964, the fundamental format has really stayed, configurative format has stayed the same. It's a massive, there it is. London Transport trying to put too much information. So why study it? Because of its huge range. Longevity, influence, use as a graphic model. Longevity I've shown you. Here is its influence in founding the genre of urban transit diagrams. And it's the grandmother or grandfather of all of them. Berlin, Madrid, Paris, even Tokyo, so Shanghai. You can hardly find a city in the world now that doesn't have some variant of this. It has an influence in a second sense, a model schema for presenting information in general. This book transit maps of the world is just really full of sons and daughters of the LUD. But it's also been used to map the Eisenhower interstate system, tourist routes in rural England, similarities and interactions amongst Shakespeare's characters. There's a fantastic line in this, it's the pale blue one called Strong and Difficult Women. I thought you'd like that. Tolkien and Middle-earth. Pub crawls in Cambridge, England. How to do the most efficient pub crawls. Even the annual web trend map uses a not very good version of the LUD. Become an object to play with in terms of form. This fantastic poster that was done for the Tate Gallery, the original place of the Tate Gallery in the 1960s, when the Victoria line was extended for the first time close to the original Tate. Just wonderful poster. Also of content, here's some artist played around with the names, famous scientists, French philosophers, I think it is, footballers, famous Italians, film stars, quite wonderful. This is the basis of a Pac-Man game of self-mapping. Bloggers just cannot resist making their own variations. Young designers keep announcing they've redesigned the better subway map. They haven't, but they keep announcing. Including some who keep seeming capable of learning any lessons at all from Beck's masterpiece. This must be the most inept I've ever seen. It's just so grotesque. As for the LUD's popularity, iconic status and sheer affection in which it's held by any